In 2023 and 24, I added to my ongoing pattern series with a group of paintings focusing on iconic desert wildlife: desert cottontails, the desert tortoise, roadrunners, javelina, and coyotes. To cap off that body of work, I decided to do a large-scale piece championing the backbone of the Sonoran desert ecosystem, the mighty saguaro cactus. Work and inspiration begins here in nature, with direct experience and observation. One of the earliest steps in my process is reviewing reference. That can mean looking through a few dozen photos or a few thousand to find just the right ingredients for a painting. I ultimately chose this image of a saguaro on Tucson's famous Tumamoc Hill. I like the twisted limbs, rich character, and signs of age on this specimen. On the computer, I digitally erase the background around the main subject. And replace it with transparency. This is a pattern painting, so it's time to start work on creating the pattern itself. All of my patterns begin this way, as simple black and white ink drawings on paper. My goal here is to create a clear, crisp, easily readable, instantly recognizable silhouette of a saguaro cactus. After finishing 4 different silhouettes, I scan them into the computer. Crop, increase contrast, and clean up edges. Next, I assemble the pattern and expand it into a full 4 foot by 6 foot design, the same size as my painting. This is the proof from the printers who will turn my design into a massive laser cut stencil. Having already decided on a lively southwestern palette, I fill in my design digitally to create a mock-up that will give me a clear idea of what the finished piece will look like. I paste in the saguaro I so carefully cut out earlier, and then print out the study at full scale in black and white using a large format printer. Using graphite and black and white colored pencils, I begin to fill in the details that were lost when I blew up my original reference photos to such a heroic scale. I create these details by both directly observing saguaros in my own garden and comparing against a wealth of detailed reference photos in my archive. But there are problems with my primary photo reference. Foliage obscures a portion of this arm here. Using gray gesso, I paint out the unwanted areas. Then reconstruct the lost details of the cactus arm using graphite and colored pencils. Having observed this cactus in person, I know that this arm attaches here. But it's not visible from this angle and makes the arm look disconnected. Using my knowledge of the plant, I am able to create a convincing arm to add clarity to the image. The finished value study will be an invaluable reference as I proceed with the painting. Now it's time to prepare the intimidatingly large 4-foot by 6-foot cradle board from ampersand. I sand and smooth edges and corners, and gesso the back. I will be putting a lot of paint on the front of this board, and gessoing the back will help guard against warpage. Now I cut thin strips of acid-free drawing paper and affix them to the edges of the board. The cradle will be a visible part of the finished piece, and I want to protect it during the painting process. Once the edge is protected, it's time to move on. I tape my study to a window, and then trace along the back to indicate the placement of the subject. With an ordinary number 2 pencil, I black the back of any part of the study I wish to transfer to the painting board. Next, I place the study on the painting board itself. It's very important that the study not move during the transfer process, so I carefully secure it with masking tape. I painstakingly trace over every single line I wish to transfer, applying good pressure with a hard 6H pencil to ensure a clean line on the other side. The study comes off, revealing a clean transfer of the cactus image, which will act as a roadmap when I begin to paint. Using a lot of ordinary masking tape, I cover over the entire image. Note that my pencil lines are still visible through this mask. With a sharp X-Acto blade, I carefully cut around the entire contour line of the cactus. I correspondingly label both the tape mask and my study to assist in aligning the right mask to the right place later on. I peel off the negative of the mask, and take care to preserve it on the back of the board, because I will need these negative pieces later in the process. Using low viscosity white gesso by Liquitex and colored gessos by Holbein, I begin mixing a background color. I make finer adjustments with admixtures of golden fluid acrylics. Because acrylics dry slightly darker than the color you see on the palette, I create test swatches, dry them with a hairdryer, and then hold them up to the printout of my study in order to compare. I then record the color on a cheat sheet. This will be invaluable if I have to remix a color later on. I brush on the background color, using 2 full coats to get adequate coverage. In this same manner, I mix 6 more colors of tinted, low-viscosity gesso to correspond to my cactus silhouettes. Because the background base coat necessarily went over my tape template, I use a Sharpie to clarify the location of the edge and act as a guide as I continue working. Next, I lay the piece flat. Now it's time to make use of the stencil I created earlier. The stencil is laser cut from a low-tack polyethylene, sort of like a thick contact paper. Because of the size limitations of the material, my stencil comes in multiple sections that must be carefully assembled. Putting on a stencil of this size is a delicate and lengthy procedure. I use tape to seal the seams where different parts of the stencil join, and to clean up edges. To conserve paint, I clearly mark places where the main Saguaro subject crosses in front of the pattern, so I will remember to leave these spaces blank. I don't want to have to refer constantly to my study while I'm painting, so I label which silhouette gets which color in advance. Every silhouette gets 2 coats of paint, the first step in bringing this colorful pattern to life. You may remember a whole series of desert pattern paintings before this one. I have created miniature versions of those animal pattern stencils for use in this painting. Inside each Saguaro silhouette, I will house a secondary pattern featuring one of the iconic animals that calls the Sonoran Desert home. This piece will feature a level of complexity I've never before attempted in this series. Patterns within patterns. Switching to high viscosity gesso colored with Liquitex heavy body acrylics and golden gel medium for added thickness, I create thicker versions of my Saguaro colors. For reasons that will become clear later on, I mix each shade just a little bit darker than the original color. When all the colors are mixed and jarred, I use the color opposite of each hue to mix a darker, desaturated version. This will be the color of each mini animal pattern. I preserve the colors in plastic bags and add them to my cheat sheet for future reference. Cutting a tiny hole in the corner of each bag and squeezing the paint through like frosting allows me to apply the paint with greater precision. I refer to this as my cake decorating technique, and it will play a much greater and more vital role later on in this process. After applying the paint with the plastic bag technique, I spread it with a palette knife, careful to consistently fill each stencil. Next comes the very satisfying job of pulling off the stencils. You will note that the animal patterns are quite raised due to the thickness of the paint I applied. Now I spackle over the wildlife silhouettes with the colors I mix for the actual saguaros. While the paint is still wet, I press in various objects to create texture. This one is a knitting screen. This shelf liner, when pressed into the paint and then lifted off, reveals a wonderful stippled effect. This tool is designed for templating irregular corners, but here it makes a fascinating wave pattern. This PVC gutter guard makes an organic polka dot texture. A broken fragment of an inexpensive plastic comb is one of my favorite tools to drag through the wet paint, creating an effect similar to cross-hatching. This decorative perforated sheet metal creates an entirely different look. I take my remaining saguaro colors and lighten them with white gesso, creating a lighter value of each hue. I spackle these colors onto the saguaro silhouettes with the palette knife, working it into the grooves and declivities. When that's dry, I return to my thinner, lighter colored gessos and apply 2 more coats over each saguaro silhouette. At long last, I get to pull off my saguaro stencils, revealing my work up to this point. These stencils are actually designed to be reused multiple times, and can be if used as intended with ink and a roller. My process, however, destroys the stencil with one use. Now I finally remove the masking tape mask that has been covering the primary saguaro image, revealing that my drawing underneath has been preserved safe and sound throughout this entire process. You may recall that I saved the offcuts from this mask. Well, now it's time to reapply them, and I know exactly where each piece belongs thanks to the corresponding letter guides I recorded on my study. Once again, I preserve the saguaro mask on the back of the board for later use. I've been using a very limited palette up to this point, but my saguaro cactus exhibits a wide range of colors. Using colored pencils, I sketch out a palette of grays, greens, blue-violets, and browns. Using thick paint again, I mix a full range of colors, preserving each in a plastic bag. Using a jeweler's head loupe for magnification, I begin the lengthy process of painting the saguaro, piping my tinted, high-viscosity gesso through a hole in each bag like frosting through a cake decorator. Because of the complexity of the image, I focus first on just applying the areoles, the raised nubs from which the spines grow, and any other details such as scarring requiring my darker range of colors. Next, I come in with my range of greens and grays to apply the saguaro's ribs. I often call this the impasto approach, referring simply to the thickness of the paint. I use the bags to apply color and the palette knife to blend and smooth. In this real-time section, you can see how terribly slow the process really is. When I finish the impasto application on the saguaro, I can finally peel off the exterior mask for the last time and discard it. But we're not done with tape just yet. Now I reapply the positive saguaro mask to protect my work up to this point as I turn my attention to the background texture. I employ the offcuts from my stencils to protect the cactus pattern. Because the polyethylene stencils don't stick well to these rough surfaces, I seal the edges with a transparent gel medium to keep paint from leaking in under the mask. Now I mix a large quantity of paint for the background, making the value just a bit darker than my original base. I also mix 3 accent colors and apply them with a sponge for textural interest. A gray-violet, a chartreuse, and a pink. When that's dry, I cover over everything with the orange color I just mixed. And while it's still wet, add textural interest with a comb. I add white to lighten my original background base color, and then apply 2 generous coats over everything, taking care to work the paint into the texture. The masks come off, now for the last time. Next, I mix a range of thinner cactus colors using a lower viscosity gesso as base, and paint it over the saguaro, taking care to accurately represent variations in color and value throughout. Now it's time for the most unusual part of my process, and that requires power tools. Using a palm sander with 60 grit sandpaper, I sand down the surface of the entire painting. As I sand, the raised ridges of the impasto underpainting emerge from the matrix, and all of my hard work up to this point finally shines through. As you can see in these details, the thinner, lighter colored gesso has filled in the cracks and valleys between the darker impasto details and patterns, leaving me with a completely smooth board but suggestive of a range of intricate and fascinating textural and color patterns. An effect I could never have achieved with a more conventional painting approach. But there's a problem. I'm concerned that the background pattern is too busy and competes with the subject, so I'll simply need to glaze it back. Masking the saguaro one last time with masking tape and Shiva Liquid Mask by Richardson, I protect the underlying image. I mix a thin, transparent gray glaze so as to push back but not lose my textures and patterns, and then scumble it over the background. Because of acrylic's rapid drying time, I have to do this process very quickly in order to have time to eliminate brushstrokes before the glaze dries out. There is no room for error. Success! As I peel off the mask, you can already see the saguaro standing out considerably better than before. Here we are before glazing and after. Next, I take golden extra heavy gel medium and matte and trowel it with a squeegee across the entire piece. 4 coats in all, top to bottom, right to left, bottom to top, and left to right. This seals in my work far beneath a thick layer of clear acrylic, and provides me the luxury of one more round of sanding, this time with a finer grit to get the board perfectly smooth. Hand sanding with a fine silica sandpaper designed for auto bodywork, and polishing with a chamois leaves me with a surface like glazed porcelain. I'm finally done with gesso and move on to a palette of pure acrylic paint. I mix colors to correspond to all of my background elements and add additional colors for the saguaro itself. A thin skin of water helps keep the paint hydrated on the palette. One downside to this impasto sand down process is that it yields very hard edges. Fine for the patterns, but less so for the cactus itself. If it is to look three-dimensional, I will have to painstakingly soften all of the edges of the saguaro. From this point on, I build upon what the impasto process gave me. It's important to understand that I am not painting over the work that I've done up until this moment. What would be the point of that? Rather, I am using targeted, transparent, and semi-transparent glazing to add contrast here, reduce it there, push this area back into shadow, and highlight this one. If the impasto approach was the blunt hammer, then this is the fine chisel that adds detail and nuance to the basic underlying structure I have created thus far. I use a variety of brushes during this process, but the number 1 liner is by far my favorite. It can be used much like a drawing stylus to make tiny but ultimately impactful details, like this suggestion of reflected light along the underside of a cactus arm. In this area, I am using a larger flat brush to add coolness and depth to a shadowed area, pushing it back without obscuring my details, while allowing highlighted areas to pop forward more dramatically. Again, I am modifying the impasto underpainting, but still allowing for all of that hard work to show through. Certain colors, like Winsor Newton's burnt sienna and Golden's green gold, combine vibrancy and transparency to make them ideal for glazing. Here, burnt sienna introduces warmth into these shadows. While green gold enlivens others. I use a nearly opaque white to pop out highlights, and a rich dark purple to push back shadows. Mixing a warm white from titanium and cad yellow deep, and thinning it to a syrupy consistency, I can finally start putting on the much neglected spines. This is an old saguaro and has lost much of its spination along the woody trunk, but new growth is still heavily armed, and adding the spines brings these areas to life. I work from medium darks to midtones. Then increasingly bright highlights to make the spines pop out towards the viewer. When the painting is done, it's time to remove the protective mask from the edge of the cradle. Scraping off the remaining tape with a palette knife. Goo Gone is a great solvent to remove any sticky tape residue, and it evaporates from the wood after 24 hours without staining. Some light sanding, and it's time to glove up for staining the edge. I've custom mixed a range of colors from Minwax's water-based product range, and select this purple for my saguaro, applying 2 coats, then finishing with a clear lacquer. At long last, my saguaro painting, the centerpiece of my desert pattern series, is finished. This is the Survivor.